There's so many cards that do this now. There are so many cards that do this now. What's up, guys? Today I'm talking about hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh!, how power creep has affected them, future design, and what I'd like to see moving forward. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So here I have a roughly chronological release order of the hand traps that I would consider to be like Yu-Gi-Oh! Defining. There are definitely ones that I haven't included on this list, but this is what I would say is my greatest 30 of all time. If you made it this far, consider leaving a like and subscribe so you can help the channel grow. Thanks so much for watching. And the interesting thing with hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that a problem exists in the game and then Konami prints a solution. And the problems that exist in the game arise from power creep, and you can see from the beginning, hand traps were originally designed to combat battle damage, and then we were removing important cards from our opponent's graveyard. Sometimes this is more of a tech. This was a staple. We started negating monster effects because monster effects started to become too powerful. We saw that searching and special summoning were happening too frequently in a turn. And so because I think of the impact of Maxi, we went down to this one-for-one hand trap design philosophy for a little while, where hand traps were really answering individual cards, one for one. And then the power of one-for-one hand traps was really acknowledged by Konami with the printing of Called by the Grave, and that was format warping, and Nibiru was game-changing. And because Called by couldn't hit Nibiru, at least part of the reason I think the crossout was printed was because Called by couldn't hit Nibiru. I just wanted to include a quick editor's note that I also think crossout designator was printed because of Maxi. Called by was like the only card, Called by Ash, and then you can cross out Maxi. So in the OCG, they just want to have as many ways to out that card as possible because it's still legal over there. And obviously Bystials were printed partially in response to tier, but also just because light and dark graveyard synergies were a thing for the lifespan of the game. And finally, Konami could not handle the going first, going second problem. And so we have reintroduced Maxi's offspring into the game. And honestly, I'll sit here and die on a hill for the Mulcharmies. I like these cards. I think it's good that they exist. And I'll do a video probably specifically about the Mulcharmies. I think they deserve a video. Long story short, I like them. I'm glad they're in the game. I could see Fua going to 2, but that's literally it. And I don't even really feel like that should happen. And in addition to the Mulcharmies, we have the Dominus cards. These are really interesting. They lock you into playing certain attributes for your primary strategies. And Songs is anti-hand and graveyard effects. And with the most modern wave of hand trap design, we see Konami leading further into deck-specific hand traps with these archetype enabling hand traps that we've seen in Justice Hunters and further on. And so foundationally, I think hand traps are kind of about enforcing a sense of equity between players. Like if you lose the die roll, you can include these cards in your deck to circumvent the downside of going second. And I think the middle section of this list is really emblematic of that, where they're generic answers that solve specific problems. Any deck can really play any of these cards. There's no benefit or downside. Of course, certain decks like Draco Tail benefit from the type synergy of spellcasters, sometimes zombie type synergy, sometimes tuner synergy. But for the most part, any deck can include these cards. They're more or less generic. And I think, again, for the most part, that their activation conditions and effects are scaled on a matrix of like impact versus usability, whereas like Droll and Maxi have to go to the graveyard for cost, and these just have to be discarded. These can be discarded, but you can't control any cards. These are pretty free in how you activate them, but they limit you retroactively. And I don't know if the difference between sending from hand to graveyard or discarding for cost was intentional, even though like Macrocosmos style effects are being removed from the game, thank goodness. And then as we leave the middle row, we get into the modern hand trap design era, which includes archetypal hand traps and attribute restrictive hand traps. These are really interesting because it does promote diversity through allowing different decks to have access to different options that certain strategies may not. But it also poses a balance problem in the sense that like a deck like Malice can get hit X number of times and still perform exceedingly well because of access to a card like Dominus Impulse. And there are Mitsurugi variants that have way higher ceilings than Pure, but Pure is putting up results because of the existence of Impulse. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but then you look at the scaling between something like Impulse and Purge, or the scaling between Impulse and Spiral, and you're like, wow, one of these things is not like the other. And I just worry that as we get into an era of more specific, more restrictive, less equitable hand trap design, even though something like Phimena or something like Izuna or something like Clip are all deterministic, like right now, the things that you can do with these cards are limited to a small corner of the universe, the small corner of Yu-Gi-Oh! But I worry that the more we limit what decks have access to what points of interaction, the more metagame defining that access is going to be. We're moving out of an era of equity where cards were going 1-for-1, and now we're moving into an era of equity in terms of game design where going first and second are more equalized because decks are built more around these concepts, but the number of decks that have access to these tools is way lower. And then with this new card, Sheena, it's hard to tell if it's going to be a one-off thing or if it's going to be a new series of like twin deities or what, like something dragons, where there's now hand traps for every attribute, and we have to equate whether or not the earth one is broken or the fire one is broken or the light one is broken or what, and then that's going to determine what decks we're able to play, and then randomly the dark one is going to have synergy with impulse or whatever. But that's only if this is a new series of hand traps, right? And ultimately there's no way to predict the future of card design, but we can go with what we have and go with the trends. And speaking of trends, one thing I wanted to talk about was modern power creep. I'm going to hover over these cards and I'll give you 1 second to think about what they all have in common. They all set or activate a card from the deck, and there's no generic answer to this game action that is becoming more and more game defining in Yu-Gi-Oh! There's so many cards that do this now. There are so many cards that do this now. I guess what I mean to say is there's no generic hand trap that negates the action of setting or activating a spell trap from the deck, and I wish there was. Because Diabellstar, Power Crept Ash, Lucas's Graveyard Effect, Power Creeps Ash, set from deck, like, you know what I'm talking about when I say this. I want Set Blossom and activate from deck Spring. And I genuinely don't think this would be as much of a problem if Ash wasn't a hard once per turn, because so many of the cards that are set or activated from the deck can be negated by Ash, but you have to draw it and it's a hard once per turn, and there are so many high priority Ash targets in the game that having another generic hand trap like this would be actually really great in my opinion. But if we don't get a new generic hand trap and Konami continues to decide to print deck specific interaction, I think that one way they can mitigate this is by continuing to print engines that lose to the existing generic hand traps in the game. And we see this with, like I said, Cool Tune, where the searchers can be negated by either Ash or Bell because they access both the deck and the graveyard. And same with Mitsurugi, like both prayers and the graveyard effects of the ritual monsters when tributed can be negated by both Ash and Bell. And with Heka Hands, where the cards that are searchers also have effects that access the graveyard, even though one of them sets a spell trap from the grave. Foundationally speaking, the logic is there. They're designing engines to interact with the non-engine that exists in the game. But if they aren't going to print a new generic hand trap to stop us from our opponents activating cards from the deck or graveyard or setting them from the deck or graveyard, I think they should bring Gamma back to 3. I'm going to say it like every single video until it happens. This card is so cool. It's a problem that it does reward decks that stay low to the ground until they push with that monster on the field, and it's not perfectly designed, which is why I would like to see a new generic hand trap enter the metagame, but it's better than nothing, and it would allow us to take Crossout Designator and Called by the Grave and Thrust out back once and for all. It also just occurred to me that I didn't really talk about Imperm at all in this video, but this card was kind of the template for the Dominus cards, I think, and it was a power creep of Veiler, and it got around Called by the Grave at the time, so I really liked this card. I'm glad it exists. But basically all of that is to say that hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are super cool. We have hand traps that 1-for-1, we have hand traps that floodgate, and they all interact with each other in this soup of the metagame where the decks that are predominant dictate what hand traps are usable. Again, we're seeing a lot of card design focused around Ash and Bell lately. We also, like I said, are seeing a lot of cards that set and activate from the deck in the graveyard. Please, Konami, give us a hand trap that stops this game action. I'm also interested to see how, like, Forbidden Crown impacts the game. This isn't a hand trap, but it is a quick play spell that's non-engine that's coming out in the next set burst protocol. But quick play spells are so polarizing that I feel like it's either going to be broken or dead on arrival, and I can't tell. I feel like it's going to be broken, though. If you made it this far, let me know in the comments what you think about hand traps and modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Design, how power creep is affecting hand trap usability, whether or not you think we're in for a new wave of an archetype of hand traps that's going to reward attribute synergies. It's all up in the air. I'm interested to see where they take it. I really want Gamma to come back. Make sure to stay tuned for next week where we'll dive right into Burst Protocol at a more detailed level, talking about Sheena, Forbidden Crown, and the engine support that's coming out in the set. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you then.